The competition for technological supremacy between the US and China will dominate the next decade. This is the premise of tonight's lecture and discussion. The question being, whose model and which country is going to win? While the US is a more formidable, its lead may be challenged by the Made in China 2025 campaign. In discussing these issues, we would like to welcome Sandy Plunkett, founder of the Innovation Clearinghouse consultancy, and UTS's own Associate Professor of International Business and Strategy, Hussain Rammal. We'll see if they can decide or predict who the winner's going to be. Now, of course, we're welcoming all of you here today, but a very special welcome to the students from Rouse Hill High School who are sitting here in the second row. I hope you also sit in the front row in your school class as well, is that right? Yeah? That's good. So the order of the day, we will begin today with Professor Rammal's overview. He will then join Sandy and Australia-China Relations Institute Director, Professor Bob Carr, in a panel discussion followed by a Q&A session with the audience. Just before we get to that, for those of you not so familiar, I'd just like to introduce ACRI to you as well, under whose auspices we're holding this event today. As many of you know, in early 2014, UTS established the Australia-China Relations Institute as an independent, non-partisan think tank to illuminate the Australia-China relationship. We also acknowledge that China contributes now more to world economic growth than any other country, accounting for 34% of Australian goods exports. By 2030, 70% of the Chinese population is likely to enjoy middle-class status. That's 850 million more middle-class Chinese than there are today. Clearly, the future will see some change. Now, since its inception in 2014, ACRI has had an enviable track record in delivering a rich calendar of events, a flow of fact sheets and briefings, sponsorship of visits to Australia by overseas policymakers and experts, research papers from academics, and public analysis in the media from the director, deputy director, and other staff. So in looking at today's event, we continue to build on that strong legacy, looking at this topic of the US versus China, who will dominate. So to kick things off, I'll call up Associate Professor Hussain Rammal, who will now present to you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always good to start something at a tech university about tech. And thankfully, all the tech is working, so that's a good start for us. I've got perhaps the easier task for today. They always say it's always difficult to find the right questions. The answers are easier. I'll disprove that by putting up difficult questions for the panel to come up with difficult answers. So I'll provide an overview of where we are and where this tech war is coming from. The main thing for us to understand with this tech war is to first get this terminology right. The media, the economists, all of them have different terminology they use. And some will talk about the knowledge economy, some will talk about innovation, the importance of that, and some will talk about, as we are today, technology and tech. Now, they are interconnected and interrelated, but it's nice for us to just clarify what it means. And I'll use these three terms to explain how we go about understanding the current scenario. So if we start off with a very simple thing, knowledge. I think we'll all agree that it's important for any country to get a leadership role to first understand what the basic principles are, how to do things. And this is where higher education institutions, like the one we are in today, play a very important role. Innovation, I will distinguish from invention. And this is where there is a bit of, I guess, disagreement amongst people. Innovation in a lot of ideas would be that you have to come up with something new. You have to invent something new. I would look at invention in two parts. I think we need to look at inventions that have already been made and inventions that will be made as a result of innovation. So innovation is just finding ways to disrupt how we do things. Now, it could be taking something that already exists and apply it in a new way, or coming up with suggestions for what we need to invent for future scenarios. Technology would be part of that future scenario invention. Coming up with tools, coming up with machinery that will help us meet those challenges of the future. So if we go in that order of knowledge, innovation, and technology, the very first thing we need to look at is, where is the knowledge being created? No surprises there that we expect between the United States and other developed countries to be leading this area of knowledge. If you look at the rankings of the top 100 universities for engineering and technology, the United States dominates it. Other European universities are also there. What is interesting there is that we've got now 7 Chinese universities that are taking a leadership role. So that old mindset of saying knowledge will come from developed countries to developing countries is being challenged. This is perhaps the building block for why we need to see the tech war in the current scenario. Now, to provide you a bit of context, there are 7 Australian universities in the list of top 100. None of them make it in the top 25. Our top 2 universities are ranked 27th in the world, and our 7th university is ranked 100. So we perhaps are losing that title as developed economies going in that area, and we're seeing developing economies coming up. What's the result of that? Why are we moving to such a rapid tech war? Well, there's rapid learning. All we have to do is look at our daily lives. 10, 15 years ago, the number of bank branches that we had, the number of people who used internet banking 15 years ago would be quite small compared to what we have now. The bricks and mortars model is changing. Artificial intelligence, robotics, automation, that's the name of the game at the moment. We are also living in a circular economy, and we can link up that circular economy to this notion of frugal engineering. I will quote Carlos Ghosn, the former chairman of Nissan, so you can see that we're keeping up to date with the latest information, who came up with this notion of frugal engineering. And what frugal engineering is a notion of accepting what we as consumers do. I mean, think about it today. I won't even ask how many of you have a mobile phone, because I would assume nearly, if not all of us, have a mobile phone. But if I was to ask you how many of you have a mobile phone that's more than 5 years old, not that many people who raise their hands. Because we are now in a situation, in an economy, where consumption is fast. We consume, we dispose, we buy new. And that creates a lot of environmental sustainability issues. So the next move is to go into a circular economy. The idea of using things that can be reused once it's finished. And that's why Carlos Ghosn came up with this idea of frugal engineering. Try to find ways of creating things that are cheaper, but they are products that are good enough. They're not something that's going to last for 15 years or 20 years, because we don't keep products that long. It's just good enough. So when we take that in the context, ladies and gentlemen, let me give you a scenario. This is what perhaps the future will look like. Years from now, you'll be sitting at home in front of your computer and you'll say, I feel like buying some shoes. Sounds relatively simple, something we do right now. But you may say, I want shoes that are tailor-made for my feet. And we will have technology that will allow you to measure the size of your feet, feed that information through a computer to a company that will then use a 3D printing system to manufacture your shoes. Your shoes will then be delivered by flying drones, something that Amazon is testing. The human element of it is disappearing. on the top right hand of the screen, that is exactly what Nike is heading towards. So for years we've been hearing about Nike facing accusations of labor issues around the world, criticism that they're manufacturing, even though they're a research and design company only, but their manufacturing is done outside of the United States. Well, the future, Industry 4.0 says you don't need to worry about it because you will not need humans to manufacture things for you. It will be done with 3D printing with different material. And the fly print system is exactly that. The upper garment of the shoes that Nike is now producing is being made using 3D printing. The human element is going away. Why is that pushing such a tech war? Well, China has done fantastically well to move people to the middle class. They've raised them up from below poverty level to a higher level. But they are the factory of the world. They have been manufacturing on behalf of the major enterprises. Now, if you take that human element away, where manufacturing doesn't need to be done manually, you're taking those jobs away. And that is the reality. China then needs to find avenues to fill those jobs in some way. And the only way to do it is to move rapidly towards manufacturing of robotics and technology. China is now the world's largest consumer of robotics and now has moved to the 6th largest exporter of robotics. It is rapidly moving as part of its plan for industrialization 4.0 to get into robotics in the future. But the other thing we need to realize when we are looking at this United States versus China concept, whose innovation is it and who is it for? Okay. The second picture on the screen you see is something, as I mentioned, is innovation using previously made inventions. It's what's called a MITI-cool refrigerator. The term MITI means clay. And it's something we perhaps would not even consider it as being important, but it is for close to 1 billion people. Countries in Asia, countries in Africa who do not have regular power supply 24 hours a day, they need something that will allow them to access innovation. That MITI-cool refrigerator is a refrigerator made out of clay, and all it requires is water to be added. And it can keep milk for up to 3 days and food for up to 7 days. Now, we are sitting in an economy where all our refrigerators are now saying we are internet enabled, we've got a television screen in front of the fridge, you can use your smartphone to look inside the refrigerator. Great. That's not going to work in a country where electricity is a problem. This is where developing economies are much smarter. The Haier Group, which is one of the leading manufacturers of white goods, has now come up with a system where refrigerators can operate even without power. They can remain cool for up to 100 hours. And that is the reason why they've got such a dominant market share around the world. Because they understand that it's not just the sunset industries that need to be taken away. They find avenues for these sunset industries. That's still innovation for a huge number of people around the world. So this notion of frugal engineering, circular economy, all of them very relevant to us. Now you may ask, where does that third one go in there? You're talking about the United States, you're talking about China, why not bring in India into it? India is not there yet. India is still in the phase of following China. India has also come up with a Make in India policy. But if you look at that Make in India policy, it's very much about trying to become the next China, trying to become the next factory of the world. So when we talk about these two major economies, they're dealing at a level much higher than the rest of the world is. Well, the next thing we need to do is start moving into this innovation idea. So we can see the knowledge, we can see the application of it. And this is perhaps the area that we hear the most by experts, and that is intellectual property rights. Now, if you're sitting right at the back, it may seem like, well, the United States is doing wonderfully well. I would, however, ask you to look at the numbers on the side. because that will show you a very different picture. The blue line is for inventions, patents. The orange line signifies trademarks. And the grey line is industrial designs. So products that are designed, car designs and so forth, that are protected. We do have to just be aware that the numbers you see up there include patents registered by firms in their home country, in foreign countries and regional markets. So there will be a double up. That there's no way that we can say that 4-point-something million trademark is a result of double up when this is about 1.6 million. So we are seeing Chinese firms very rapidly moving up, coming up with new technology, registering it, and applying it around the world. Now, when the panel I'll ask the expert panel later on to perhaps look into this area. Where's this technology coming so rapidly from? Is a question perhaps we all need to ask, but this is the reality of where we are with the current business. Again, what else is driving this? And I have now added one more element in there, another country, that's Australia. So we've got the United States, we've got China, and we've got Australia. This is essentially the entrepreneurship support indicators that countries provide. Now, historically, if you looked at those indicators, what we found was much of the support for entrepreneurship, which we usually refer to thinking about small and medium enterprises, was given to state-owned enterprises in China. But over time, what we're seeing is that it's now moving to what we would call genuinely small, medium enterprises in China. They are getting the government support to come up with new innovation. The way we use our mobile phones, for those of you who visited China, you will find that perhaps they are much more advanced in how their mobile phones are used for transfer of cash, transfer of currency. We are getting there. A lot of countries that we would classify as developing countries have moved far ahead of us. But interestingly enough, here, out of the 12 indicators, 7 of them is where China outperforms Australia and the United States. And one that perhaps stands out quite a lot is this R&D transfer. And the R&D transfer is about the government providing access to new technology to small and medium enterprises, and that technology is shared. So it's R&D at the level of the national country level, and is it shared with small and medium enterprises? And that allows for entrepreneurship to take place. You can also see that in terms of taxes and bureaucracy, it's a much better support system for the Chinese entrepreneurs than it is for the American or Australian entrepreneurs. Similarly, access to land is also made much easier for Chinese entrepreneurs than it is for Australian or American entrepreneurs. So all of these indicators are suggesting that there is support and push for rapid learning for the reasons that I mentioned earlier on. The result of that is that this year, for the first time, China has entered the top 20 countries for innovation. And when you look at the rise of it, it has been quite rapid. So if you look at China at 17th, the parentheses show you the previous year's ranking, there were 22. The year before that, there were about 25. Australia used to be around 16 a couple of years ago. Australia has dropped down and has come back in now. So it's a good sign. But China's trajectory has been going up. And it's been going up because of all of these different indicators that I've just mentioned to you. So these are signs that we are no longer going to be looking at countries like China as producers of low-cost products. They are rising up and rising very quickly. So what are the trends? Well, this whole technology war is going to create issues for both sides, China and the United States. China could lose up to 50% of the current manufacturing jobs in the next 10 years. Not any better for the United States. About 38% of the jobs are classified as high-risk jobs that could be taken over by robotics. The Made in China plan, 2025, is very ambitious, unlike the Make in India plan, which is about building infrastructure, tourism, and so forth. The Made in China plan is about technology, semiconductor industry. 70% of the things that will be produced, or 70% of the high-end supply chain things, that's the target that it should be made in China by the year 2025. So it's a lot of intellectual property, it's a lot of knowledge that needs to be generated between now and then to fulfill that plan. The difference between the two for me that really stands out at this point is this notion of where you can test your new products. Failure of a product can be the death of the product. We've seen that in the aviation industry. If your products fail, consumers won't buy it. But China has got something which other countries don't, and they have built that up, and that is the One Belt, One Road initiative. Let me give you a very quick example, and I will only pick on one particular area. So if you look at this map, it gives you an issue for China, and this is long-term planning on their behalf. When you look at the map for China, everything is on the eastern border. Access to seaports on the east. There is nothing on the west that allows them to access a sea. Now, traditional thinking of this would be, you've been dealt a bad hand in geography, you just have to do everything from the east. But no. China has been actively working towards building this One Belt, One Road initiative that includes land routes, but also includes sea routes, what's known as the Maritime Silk Road, or the String of Pearls. What this doesn't show you, perhaps, is also within countries the inter-network connections that are taking place. I'll give you the example of this point to this point. Currently, China, which is one of the largest importers of oil, has to get oil transported all the way through to here. That means going through the South China Sea, which is not the friendliest of places at the moment. What they have done is they've decided to open an oil refinery in Kashgar, in the Urumqi area. And what they've done is, instead of thinking about producing things and then transporting all the way to Europe, they will now be moving production to this area. Well, you may ask, well, how are they going to get the oil going there? It would be quite expensive. Well, what they're doing now is going to other developing countries and saying, we will build the infrastructure for you. We will not give you loans, we will provide you with service. And that service is, we will build this port for you and connect a road network all the way up there. And this is precisely what's taking place in the Pakistan-China economic corridor, which is worth $60 billion. And that $60 billion is not coming in cash, it's coming in kind. Chinese firms are building the roads, Chinese financing firms are providing the related finance for it, and it is building up an extremely good infrastructure here. It helps Pakistan, which relies heavily on foreign support, and China provides that for them. And recently, the statement from Tanzania about the Bagamoyo port is also very important. A $10 billion port being built, which will be the biggest port in East Africa. And the only thing they said was, it's much easier to deal with the Chinese because they do not put a lot of terms on it. It's done quietly, they give the support that's needed, but we don't have to deal with the issues that IMF and other bodies would. So this is where you've got an opportunity for Chinese firms to move into big markets in terms of population, test their products, because even if there is a failure, it will not affect their brand, because the country will provide all the support you need, because they're allies. It's an economic relationship much stronger than perhaps historic relationships could have been. So this is where they've got an advantage. And you're seeing the result of that in high-tech areas. Defense, for example. China is now one of the largest exporters of ammunition around the world, of defense products. Pakistan, which was historically a major ally of the United States, now buys 70% of its ammunition from China. 10th largest import in the world, getting it from the 5th largest export in the world. So these are the sort of things where China can even have products tested in another market and perhaps find ways of bettering it before it hits other developed economies. And there is this emphasis on rapid learning, and we're seeing that by Tencent's investment and shares in Tesla and other companies that are rapidly buying products. Hire Group buying Fisher & Paykel in Australia, General Electric products, all of this part of quick acquisition and learning that the Chinese firms are doing. The United States continues to be the major hub of knowledge, there's no doubt about it, but it is pushing for more US-based testing, more US-based manufacturing, bringing things home rather than saying, let's go outside. So, in summary, and this is where I'll put the tough questions for the experts to answer rather than myself having to do it. What does this continued trade war mean for us? If the United States is successful in putting this trade war into practice, we may be heading back to the time of George Bush Jr., when American car manufacturers were being forced to use American steel, which was not the most efficient, and consumers rejected the products. Today, we can see where the American car manufacturing sector is. Are we heading towards inefficiency? Are we going to limit choices for consumers? Where's the future of work going to be? What sort of knowledge do we need to provide if jobs that were traditionally there will soon evaporate, disappear because of technology? Are we going to see brakes being put on technology because of protectionism? Our country is going to be worried about massive job losses and saying, let's stop the pace at which we are advancing, just so that we can continue to provide this. Perhaps not, but perhaps some countries may. Australia is in an interesting position. It's got free trade agreements with both countries. The only country, perhaps, that didn't get affected by these barriers from the United States, cordial relationships with both countries. Will it be forced to choose in the future which side you support? That's more of a political issue rather than an economic reality, but this is the reality they will face. And finally, where is Australia going to head in the future? Are we still going to think about developing products for Western Europe, North America, or are we going to look in the neighborhood and say, look, there are these countries that could possibly benefit from our sunset industries? Perhaps some of the technology that is now being considered outdated in our economy could be transferred into those markets. So do they go down the China path of saying, let's head into other developing economies and take advantage of their huge consumer base? Or do they go down the American path and say, we will only be producing high-end products for developed economies that can afford these products? With that, ladies and gentlemen, I will now pass it on to the expert panel to further this discussion. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Bob Carr. I'm Director of the Australia-China Relations Institute here at UTS, and very interested in this question, but no expert myself, so I'm going to be asking you, Hussain, the tough questions. You're not going to shovel them off to me. And Sandy, we welcome. Sandy is a leading commentator and analyst specialising in the global technology arena with 25 years' experience in Australia and overseas. And she's worked in media, venture capital, and with a Silicon Valley startup that went public on NASDAQ. She's written extensively on these issues, and she's got a lot of good ideas. Now, we are honoured to have students here tonight from Rouse Hill High School, studying Mandarin. I congratulate them on picking a hard subject. And of course, from their generation, they got a keen interest in technology. So my question of you, Hussain and Sandy, is to back your hunches and just venture a guess on whether the world they're going to be working in the year 2050 will have China and not America as the dominant player in technology, the largest provider of innovation. Now don't be wishy-washy, a bit of this, a bit of that. I really want you to stick your necks out. That not too many people will remember what you said at UTS in December 2018 on the edge of our Christmas holidays. By 2050, you won't be held to account. You won't be hauled before a people's tribunal.
Also by 2050, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, what's your hunch? Taking into account everything we've just seen, everything you've been doing and studying, Sandy, we'll start with you. No one's more
Great, I get all the good jobs.
These youngsters from a Sydney high school, the world they're in 2050.
Well, I'm not dodging the question, but I will say of all these Mandarin students, by 2050 and well before that, there will be instantaneous translation from one language to another. Now, that's not to say that you're not doing a great thing in learning the language, because understanding culture is a much, much bigger theme than just being able to translate something. But technology is going so fast. Natural language processing, AI, is absolutely moving so fast that we will be experiencing almost seamless translation of many languages within, I'd say, 10, 15 years. So that's the first thing. But not to dodge your question, the US, you would never put the US out of any race, really. Not in the short term and not in the long term. However, China is a really, really, really interesting country to look at in terms of its technology. And its ambition with its technology in 2018. And it has been for in the last 10, 15 years, but it's really, really accelerated. China is trying to leapfrog in many capacities by harnessing not just state power, like state-run power, but also by emulating, and fairly well successfully emulating, some of the very venture capital entrepreneurship models of the West, particularly Silicon Valley, to get a leapfrog into future industries, or industries that it defines as extremely strategic. And by the way, the industries that it defines as strategic are also the industries that the US defines as highly strategic. And of course, Australia should, in fact, define them as strategic as well. And they are robotics, AI, they're also, gene splitting, gene know-how. So it's across the board, and it's also leveraging the application of these technologies and the testing of these technologies through its huge domestic market, and by also making strategic acquisitions in a range of sort of technology and startup companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And of course, that sort of ambition and aggression that China's been showing in the tech space is really making the US very sort of nervous. It's a geopolitical sort of existential threat. And as we've seen with the G20 in Buenos Aires this weekend, is that people were waiting where the Trump and Xi Jinping would sort of would escalate the sort of the trade war and the tariff war. What we seem to have is that we've now got a bit of a time lag, 90 days for certain agreements to be ironed out. A lot of those agreements are not just about sort of trade in steel and aluminium. They are very much about intellectual property, forced technology transfer, prohibitive trade practices that the US sees that China is doing. So technology is key to the geopolitical positioning and threat to the United States of America, and will continue to be in the next decade or more.
Will it even off though, or will China's challenge to America continue to grow at the rate we've seen. Sometimes we get into trouble by projecting the future based on
What it
present
is now.
trends. We don't allow for the prospect that the challenger might plateau.
Well, that's always a possibility, and China has. It's not all blue sky. There are deep concerns in China, high debt, very high debt levels for one. Also, sort of just internal issues about, bringing that large population to the middle class. It's not. They've done fantastic in the last sort of 20 years, but it's not without its problems. But in also, America likes to have a rival. It's always enjoyed its rivals, and particularly in the technology sphere. In the 1980s, their rival was Japan.
America does get paranoid and jumpy. I've written about this myself.
Right.
And right now, American political leadership is unified by the view that China is overtaking them, and it's using unfair methods
Right.
to do it. And they're determined to curb that. This is
Yeah.
a consensus in American political leadership. How successful, if you're in Washington,
Yes.
is it viable to think you can lop a few percentage points off China's growth path? Is it possible for America to do what it seems to be daring to attempt, and that is to curb China's growth? Saying, you leap in, have you got a view on whether that's within the capacity of America to do?
I think they probably will try and do it. I'm not sure how successful they would be, because it's the American consumer that will raise questions about it. Because if you are forcing people to buy American products that are more expensive, that perhaps are not as efficient as other products are from other parts of the world, that will create an issue with the consumer itself. So if the consumers rise...
Like your example of American cars.
As American cars. So we've seen that in the past, and I mean, computers are another thing. Are we going to go back to American-made computers from scratch? I don't think we will. I don't think Apple is going to change its model anytime soon either. So there is this fear that companies may fall into line, but there is also the company's strategic viewpoint. They can always split the company up. Like Apple does. You've got the Apple America and then Apple International registered in Ireland. So companies will find ways around loopholes, and I think it has to be a natural thing where America needs to prove that these products are the best that can be made in the world, that we are producing the best. If it's a forced thing, I think people will look at other avenues to move to.
Okay, well, to be specific, if you're a jumpy, paranoid American leader, and you're looking at what China's doing on artificial intelligence, what could you do to prevent China overtaking the US in that field? China said, made in China 2025. Perhaps they were a bit too provocative in laying that down, because they're frightened hell out of Americans. But have Americans got the capacity to say, this is the weaponry we're going to deploy, and we're going to stop China overtaking us in artificial intelligence? Is it possible to do that?
I don't think it's possible. What it is, it's a competition. It's a competition, and the competition could be healthy. But if you're what did you say, paranoid American in Washington, trying to stop AI, well, then you've got to develop your own AI, and you've got to be way ahead. But the way the US looks at the rise of China in tech is that China has accelerated by IP theft, right? So, and the accusation is much more than just sort of, back engineering. It is literally cyber terrorism in that sense. The Chinese have armies of cyber warriors that are being used for great and at times devastating effect, and many of them are being well publicized. So
yeah, the American position is that all countries spy on one another using cyber, but
yes.
China is putting cyber espionage at the service of industrial competitors of
Yes,
America.
yes. So it's almost like the Chinese view
Using it
is
economically.
that politically it's okay,
Yep.
you know, despite
You'll
each
do
other,
it. You'll do it.
but
You'll
commercially you don't steal our stuff.
No.
Okay. So so one of the issues that will come out of the G20, you know, the 90-day or so before supposedly things fall apart or they get realigned between China and the US in this way, is how do you enforce? Enforcement is in fact the issue that a US, even a strong, innovative US has in trying to combat an aggressive and increasingly technologically savvy China.
Yeah, well, America's saying you're stealing our intellectual property.
Yeah, and China says prove it.
Yeah, and China says prove it, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And America's saying if you don't stop stealing it, we're going to increase tariffs on your exports by 25%.
That's right.
How does China demonstrate that it's changed policy and it's ceased to use cyber to steal industrial secrets?
I'm not sure it can actually do that beyond a platitudinal demonstration. What it can do, perhaps, is be more open in other sort of deals and in foreign capital going into the US. And Hussain, would you agree? So, in other words, it may look. Cyber espionage is here to stay, and some countries right now are better than others, but others are really big. They're all going to try and. I mean, this is the real war. It's cyber espionage.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying, how close is China being to a mature economy which has got intellectual property of its own to protect? In other words, I spoke to a lawyer in a big law firm in Sydney with a lot of connections with China, and she said to me that the Chinese company, Huawei, has now got legal action in 35 countries defending its inventions from theft by other states. In other words, they now invent, they produce intellectual produce, and they've got to ward off people from other jurisdictions coming in to pinch it. So in other words, as the Chinese economy matures, as it gets more like a Western economy, it's got a stake in enforcing IP protection.
It's absolutely a great question.
How far
and
are
you're
we from
right.
that, though, when they become conservative keepers of intellectual property?
One way of looking at that is to have a look at what's happening in 5G mobile. I mean, one of the ways that China has been really able to accelerate its consumer-based sort of internet, its own internet system and e-commerce in China has been through the iPhone. It hasn't been through the desktop computer or the laptop computer. It's definitely been through the iPhone. And so the wireless network is so strategic to all of us. But it has been extremely just strategic to China, and they are ahead, and Huawei are ahead. So that is a classic example where China and Huawei has been blocked from investing and carrying out great sort of wireless business in the US and in Australia, and so there is increasing pressure and therefore increasing incentive on China to sort of play by some of the rules with which the US and others have been accustomed.
Hussain, you raised the difficult question of which tech model Australia is going to follow. Now, on this question of Huawei being excluded from supplying the 5G network in Australia, I've been asked by the media what I think of it. I say I'm neutral. I just don't know. I'm not in government. I haven't got access to security briefings. Security briefings haven't come in to brief me on what the implications are in this. So I'm neutral. I can't comment on it. I'm not part of the National Security Committee of Cabinet that made a decision to exclude the Chinese tech giant. But does it raise the difficulty when we exclude them that if China comes out on top in all these areas, we're disadvantaged because we've got inferior technology and it doesn't lock in with theirs?
Absolutely, and I'll follow on from what Sandy just said. China has moved from the 1980s when it was seeking markets overseas to now seeking resources. It doesn't need to seek markets anymore. It's got a huge market. The world's largest mobile phone subscription service is China Mobile. They don't need to go international. They've got a huge market domestically. What they are trying to do is that rapid learning. And I completely agree with you. They will learn. They will find, perhaps not as rapid if we start blocking them, but they will learn. And when they do, we will perhaps be, as countries like Australia will be, seeking the latest technology from them. So we need to have a situation where that takes place. I mean, as you raised earlier, can the United States stop them from robotics? I think it's going to be very hard, because the only way you can do it is, again, to stop the people who buy the Chinese products. But if China is saying, we need to sell it to our own consumers, that possibility goes. And where there are other market opportunities, like I mentioned in Africa, in Asia, again, China has, one of the things China, I feel, does well is diplomacy. It does things in a way that's not on stage. You don't need to come out and make massive statements. I'm referring, of course, to the person who said a jumpy, perhaps a politician in Washington, might come up and say some things via Twitter or somewhere else. But the Chinese don't do that. The Chinese tend to keep it at a diplomatic level. We don't hear that much. Things that have happened in Africa with their investment, yes, there were things that faced problems, but they didn't come out in the media to discuss it. So what China does is it creates these alliances and allies, and consumers in the future will be buying products that are made in China or made by Chinese firms, because they'll be the first movers. So I think what we are seeing is perhaps now a more difficult task for countries like America to stop that technology transfer.
You just used what I refer to as a killer fact a moment ago. The challenge of America in stopping China's growth in these technological areas in robotics is pretty clear. If the Chinese are making robots for their own industries, because they're the biggest consumer of robots in the world, how does America stop them producing better and better robots? The demands within China.
That's correct.
Well, first of all, Japan is the world leader in robotics.
Yeah.
By a long margin, a wide margin. Much smaller, but of course Japan also sells to other markets. So again, this is not a binary. This is not. I mean, I know it's a binary topic because it's a sexy and powerful topic, but it's not a binary discussion, right? Because diplomacy, complexity, global markets, at the end of the day, right, they force people into some sort of cooperative stance, hopefully, unless, the South China Sea problems get out. I mean, it's always risky, right? But in robotics, AI, technology is a very, very global pursuit. The know-how behind technology is a very increasingly global. Venture capital has globalized extraordinarily.
Well, you know Silicon Valley well.
Yes.
Is capital going out of Silicon Valley
Absolutely.
into China?
Absolutely. In the last 10 years, the pace at which, I mean, what was it? Definitely sort of even 7 to 10 years ago, Silicon Valley was the source for 95 to 97% of the world's venture capital money, right? Today, China has about 25% of that share. And most of those gains have happened in 3 years. Literally.
That's China investing
China
in high tech.
China investing venture capital in US companies.
In the US.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right? Which hardly ever happened, 5 years ago. And equally, very high, similar proportion of money is going from Silicon Valley and American venture capitalists to Chinese startups. It is literally a very good indication of the fact that the startup and entrepreneurial communities in China and the US, they both see opportunities in each other, strategic and commercial, right? So, I mean, when I first came back, I lived in Silicon Valley for 15 years and came back to Australia five years ago. and I worked in venture capital and with a startup. When I came back 5-6 years ago and I talked to my Silicon Valley colleagues and asked them, hey, is China tech a threat to you? Right? Because it wasn't when I was working in venture capital and Silicon Valley, it was never mentioned. And they were like, no, China steals our stuff, China is not open, we can't get into their markets. That was all the talk. Today, about a year ago, about 2 years ago, it all changed. When I asked my US VC colleagues, did you see China as a threat? It all changed. I mean, they see it as a huge market opportunity, but they absolutely see China in a very, very different light because of the way it's accelerated.
That's pretty sobering. Does that reflect your experience?
I would agree with what Sandy's saying. And it's hard to, as you said, choose one or the other. Wishy-washy is what we'll have to be, especially since I'm an academic. That's what I do. Yeah.
So you've got these high school students wanting a clear answer to the question. In the year 2050, when they're going to be running businesses and making decisions about investment capital and all the rest,
before that,
are they going to be dealing with a China that dominates this space or a US that dominates this space?
You said 2050. It's
2050, yeah.
Plenty of time for me to make an incorrect prediction.
that's what he said.
Based on what I'm seeing, I think, again, I'm looking at more in the developing economies, but I think China will dominate. That's my gut feeling.
Well, hold on, let me get you to be more precise about that. Are there areas that you would carve out and say, but not here? You'd say that China will dominate across the board, simply because of the scale of its domestic demand, like for robotics, but there are areas where the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are going to wipe out their Chinese competitors every time. Would that area be driverless car technology, for example, or something else?
Yeah, I would say more the sciences area of pharmaceutical, for example, because I think the fact that they were doing so much reverse engineering, for them it's still buying a lot of patents that the Japanese used to hold, but those are patents for products that are not seen as innovative anymore. I don't think China will be that rapidly getting into creating new drugs and so forth. That's
bound to be an American specialty.
I would say American and possibly a West European, Sandy.
I would agree about the pharmaceuticals. Look, I think AI, in certain areas of AI, I think China will definitely lead. I think in genetic mapping, I think China has. Well, you would have. Did people see the controversial news of last week with twin embryos being genetically modified by a Chinese professor? Somewhat on the quiet, and it's very controversial, but that is certainly something to watch because the world has changed forever as a result of that ability. So genetic mapping, AI is a very big field. It's a combinatorial field, so there's a lot to it. So there's a lot of room for people to have their little specialties and their wins, but China will definitely play there.
Will China or the US be more likely to cure spinal injury and disease? To enable a Christopher Reeve to get up out of his wheelchair and walk across a room. Where will that invention come from?
That's a great one, because one of the criticisms still of China, even though it has accelerated, is that the US has that monopoly, that distinctive culture monopoly for creativity and thinking out of the box, which is so crucial to those amazing breakthroughs such as that. But I think, as we just found with the twin embryos, is that China's could do that too. So I think also you've got to have a look at other things about technology, consumer tech. It's huge, right? What people don't really understand is like the rare earth metals that go into making your phone smart, but also it goes into sort of wind turbines and MRI machines and whatever. China has a massive monopoly on that rare earth metal mining, extraction and supply. and one of the reasons is because they've been investing in it and doing it for several decades. But one of the reasons, I mean, Australia has got a very nice supply of rare earth metals, right? But extracting them is very messy.
What advantage does that confer on China, having that specialty in rare earth metals?
They control pricing. They control
mobile
the
phones?
No, for rare earth metals, they're not rare in terms of they're actually more in abundance than they're not hard to find. They're rare because they're called rare because you only need them in tiny quantities to transform and make a product, electronics and technology.
So
products.
in what products would that confer on China rather than the US?
Well, as I said, the rare earth metals are increasingly being used in any electronic digital product, and the world is going digital. So as I said, it's anything from wind turbines to mining equipment to mobile phones to the future mobile phones so it's
okay. The polar ice caps are melting, and the planet in which these youngsters are going to be in charge is facing a colossal challenge from human-generated climate change. Is America or China more likely to give us, for example, solar-powered air conditioning that would prevent the need for 1,000 coal-fired power stations around the planet? Where's it more likely to come from?
At the moment, China is leading in, US is leading in storage for solar.
In storage?
Yes, yeah. Which is crucial, which is the crucial technology. But China is spending billions in battery and storage research. So, it's a race. It's a competition.
What about in developing small, almost portable nuclear power stations, safe, with minimal waste, reactor safety, minimal waste, overcome, that gives the nuclear renaissance at last a chance of providing an alternative to wretched coal-fired power? More likely to come from China or from the US?
I think China.
I think China too.
Really?
I think China.
China's actually, and as I said, one of the reasons they can do that is they've got test markets. So at the moment they're
or
already...
the Belt and Road. Or
the One Belt, One Road thing. So at least in Pakistan they've already started looking at it, in the south, Karachi, which is one of the largest cities in the world. They're going to have a nuclear power station around there, a small built one, just because of the critical energy problems they're facing.
Provided by Chinese.
Provided by Chinese firms.
Yeah, I agree. I think Hussein's right about that.
But again, focus on that colossal concentration of talent you've got in an institution like MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Where would America be confident of maintaining a lead? Would it be in research? Let's accept that they've lost a lot of their vehicle industry, but might it be in cutting-edge laboratory research that gives us driverless or electronic vehicles?
America would say, you're probably not going to like this answer, but America, cutting edge, the thing that it can really harness is, I mean, going back to your definition of difference between innovation and invention. Invention, people invent everywhere. Australians got a great inventive, sort of culture. We don't have a great commercialization culture. Innovation, innovative nations imply its ability to commercialize and sell into global markets. The US has had the second to none, right, in terms of the ability to take that R&D, to apply that R&D money. The US is still the largest spender of R&D, although China is really beefing up. But it's still the largest spender of R&D, and it is the greatest translator of that R&D into globally powerful commercial enterprises. I think that's America's edge.
That's America's edge, but you make the point in some of your writing that China's firms, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, those firms are not state-owned. They're about as private and profit-minded as any US entity.
That's right, and
out
I
there.
hate it when you check up on me like that. No, it's well said. Yes, one of the things that's people make the mistake with China at the moment is that those firms, Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, others, basically came out of seemingly nowhere in like 10 years, all venture capital funded. They are not state-run companies. So one of the interesting lessons that I think the party has learned, because they 30 years ago, Deng Xiaoping sort of he sort of said, like, semiconductors are highly strategic for China. And so they invested billions and billions into semiconductor research and plants. Literally 30, 40 years later, there's still a laggard in semiconductors. The US still dominates there. So I think the lesson that they've learned is that state-run, when it comes to innovation, not just R&D, but innovation and the application and commercialization of it, absolutely works better when it's private sector venture capital backed.
Okay, well here's a way of opening up the big subject of how China reacts to America's what appears to be a declaration of economic war on China by the United States. China could pour more money into its state-owned companies, like those that lost those fortunes in semiconductors. It could say that they're the keepers of the Chinese flame. They're the keepers of socialism with Chinese characteristics. It could decide to build up those state-owned enterprises, which have been on the decline. They've been shrinking as the private sector has grown. And maybe President Xi, as a party ideologue, is driven to do that by his political instincts. On the other hand, some reformers in China that I've spoken to say Trump's challenge could be good for us. It could force really vigorous reform and opening up. And an Australian banker with a keen interest in China said, look, it's going to be very interesting. Maybe China will react to this challenge by just opening their gates, opening the economy, allowing foreign investors in, European firms as well as the American firms, and making a dash for growth. How does China react? Is their leader more visionary than ideologue? Could you get a burst of really creative, really bold, really reformist opening up?
I think it goes back to your point, is China a mature economy? I think it's nearly there. It's getting there. And if it is a mature economy, it will open up. It has to, because you can take examples in Southeast Asia of countries that were going on that path and then decided to keep their market a bit closed. I'm referring to countries like Malaysia that had a lot of barriers. And we've seen the results again in there. There's been a lot of their industries that didn't prosper because they didn't have competition. I think competition will actually be good for China. It will drive them to do even better. The thing is, you can have new companies come in China. They've been there for a while, but the new ones come in. It will still take them time to learn about the local business. And by the time they do that, it gives enough time for the Chinese firms to build up their competitive advantage. So I think it will be, I agree, I think it will be good for China if it started at this point reforming some of these things to make it more competitive for the future.
And you're saying they're likely to do it because they're going to have to.
They'll probably have to, yeah.
Because they're nearly at the point of being a mature economy, and that's how a mature economy will respond to ferocious competition.
Absolutely.
What do you think, Sandy, based on your knowledge of both countries?
I tend to agree with the saying there, but also I think we're going to see at least some indication, small indication of whether that's true or not. If this is this sort of agreement between Trump and Xi is to have 90 days to map out certain issues about IP protection, tech transfer, and sort of restrictive practices in China and elsewhere. I think we will see something about that in 90 days. I think it'll be extremely interesting to see what comes out of that. And if nothing does, then Trump's threatening to raise the tariffs again.
So you're saying the Chinese are under pressure and you'd expect them to react intelligently, with a bit of vision, by opening up their economy further?
That is my sense.
Okay, we've got this nice little country, Australia. We like it very much. It's a quaint and funny country. Not really known for innovation.
No.
Not known for innovation. We pump up our economy by high levels of immigration and build apartments. That's how we
That's right.
generate our wealth, it seems. We don't do enough of what this high school is doing. That is getting youngsters from non-Chinese backgrounds, non-immigrant families, to learn a really hard language, which is Mandarin.
And to understand.
Yep, we've only got a few hundred across Australia studying Mandarin in high school without Chinese ancestry, which is. Are we smart enough? And you've got Michael Fullylove from Lowy with an article in the Fairfax Press today saying the world is finding it a bit hard to take seriously a country that has a different Prime Minister every year, 5 Prime Ministers in 5 years, and pictures of Angela Merkel at the G20 in Buenos Aires with our Prime Minister across the desk, and she's looking at one of those briefing notes Prime Ministers get with a picture of the leader they're meeting and then a summary of their career and position for a speed dating meeting with a bit of speed dating diplomacy. Are we smart enough to negotiate our way through this titanic competition between China and the US and carve out a bit of investment and jobs growth for us back here?
It doesn't seem like we are. I mean, I'm sorry, but I mean, maybe in a few days I'll think to, I don't know, but every second day, this is a question that I think is a very, very important one. I mean, we are the lucky country in terms of our natural resources, but we've dug a lot of stuff out of the ground, and we've grown a lot of good stuff on our land, on our wonderful land, and we've sold it to a resource-hungry China. And in that period of high hungry China growth, we have been extremely complacent about the stuff in our heads, how it's put there, and what wealth it creates for future generations. I'm frustrated with not just Australia's political leadership, but our business and industry leadership too. I think it's complacent and stuck in a lucky country sort of world of yesterday.
Hussain?
Well, we just have to look at the patents that are registered. If you look in Australia, it's CSIRO and Cochlear. They're the top 2 patent registrants. If you look at China, it's Huawei and others. It's Alibaba and so forth. So again, where is it coming from? Is it coming from one national research body, or is it now starting to look at private enterprise as well? I think this is the sort of questions we've been having for a few years. Manufacturing sector going down, agriculture will run out. What are we going to do next? I ask this question every semester for my students, and the answer is always, don't know. So, I mean, we talk about services, but what exactly in services are we going to do when all our services, when you pick up a phone and call a customer service from a very basic thing, is outsourced? So if we're going to say we're going to be trade and services agreement in the future, Australia is going to lead that, we need to know exactly what high-tech services we're going to provide. And it's, again, sort of jobs for the future. What jobs will be there? And we need to train. The knowledge needs to come from the very basic.
And in services, where is the IP held? Because it is the IP that has the value.
Now, let's end on a positive note.
Sorry.
We have got excellent universities.
We do.
We have got a lot of inventiveness. Our multiculturalism confers a lot of specialised knowledge of great markets, India, China, the Gulf states, for example.
Well, if I may, I'll say one thing Australia has. We're very critical if we need to be, and that's not a bad thing. I think if you're pushed into doing something that's considered to be the right thing, you're never going to be innovative. We are not good at exploiting and exploring our innovation, but we are a very innovative country. We just need to find the right channels because we can be critical and seek new avenues. So I think Australia does have a bright future if all the infrastructure and support is there for it.
Well, Sandy, you sum up. So you summon up something optimistic to say, and I'll just alert the audience. I'll be coming to them when you finish speaking to get their questions. What would make you optimistic about this country's capacity to carve out some competitive advantage for it
The young.
in a world where China and the US are
the young,
in combat?
the next generation of graduates entering the workforce who are digital natives. They are, I think, more exposed, like internationally, globally exposed. I think Australian has typically been very inward looking. And I think that competitive, the global market for jobs is forcing that international exposure. And so I think the hope I have is for the next generation to really change, fundamentally change the shape and nature of Australia's ambition as well as its capability.
My reason for being optimistic, and after this I'll invite questions. We're talking about competition between China and the US. We've got very good knowledge and a great reservoir of experience in dealing with both. And don't forget, we've got 1.2 million in Australia of Chinese heritage.
Right.
1.2 million. And if we can't leverage that as an advantage, along with the investment flow, we've got the trade flows with China, we've got investment flows into America, Australian investors and American investors into Australia. Our China literacy and our US literacy, knowledge of both great countries, should confer on us an advantage if we're alert enough to deploy it. Always like to underline the optimistic when we have these discussions about national challenges.
Yeah.
So let me invite questions from anyone here. Certainly we're keen to have students challenge our panel. Any questions? Well, think about it, because I'll call on anyone from James Roos, but in the meantime, a question up here.
Yeah, I've got a question for the panelists. I'm a Chinese, so we were talking about the competition between the US and China. So I think one of the panelists said they say US was kind of nervous about Chinese growth. And I was wondering why the Americans are nervous about that. So that's what the Americans really think about that. So do the Americans really think that America is the only ones in the world that can be leading the world? Are they really think China is going to kill them if China wins this competition? Which I don't think so.
I know it's a great question. I think some of us commented earlier that there's part of the US culture is very, very competitive, and it has tended to always like a rival. I mean, this is just one way to think of it. When I first went to, I started my career in journalism, and when I always covered the tech beat, and I would go to the US a lot, and my first trip not to the US was to Japan, Tokyo, and it was in 1989, it was the day Tiananmen Square massacre happened, and I was in Tokyo, and the news was everywhere, obviously, about the massacre, and I was flipping channels in my hotel room in this, extraordinary news environment, and there was some, bunches of big Texans standing atop, it was CNN, and they were standing on top of Honda cars with sledgehammers bashing Hondas. It was called Honda bashing. The reason why I'm telling you that is because I was a young journalist at the time, and I remember thinking, wow, the hatred that the US and the fear, it was really fear, not so much hatred, the fear that they were demonstrating for Japan in the symbol of Honda, the company, was just immense. And it was an overreaction. I think what it is, it's about US hegemony. They fear fragility. They fear being vulnerable in strategic industries. And that's the best way I could sum it up in my understanding of that.
A question from one of the students from Rouse Hill High School.
Hello, I was just wondering, in the future, by 2050, which nation do you believe will be investing more in Australia's innovation technologically? The US or China?
China.
So emphatic.
I think so, yes. Yes. Definitely.
Hussain?
I would have said hopefully Australia, but you know.
That'll never happen. No, do you think?
I think, yeah. I mean, China is still, you know, the closeness that we've got in terms of geographic location. Absolutely, I agree with that.
And can I just add also, if we think optimistically and going off what Bob's saying is there's 1.2 million Australian Chinese heritage engaging better and better with China and the Asian century. If that happens, then most definitely it'll be China.
Another question from Rouse Hill.
As you previously stated that America can be very fragile with how they react to stuff, is there a possibility of a war possibly striking out over tech? Like China taking over the competition and the US going, we don't want this, we'll fight back over it. Is there any chance of that happening?
In my opinion, it won't. They'll never say it's over tech. I mean, but tech is geopolitics. Tech has always been at the heart of geopolitical sort of concerns, and it's especially in the 21st century. So it's at the moment the conflict and the vulnerabilities is about South China's ambitions in the South China Sea. So it's about trade routes and access. But so I don't think they will ever say it. There won't be a war that breaks out over AI. AI will be used for somebody to win that war if it breaks out.
I agree with you. Yeah, absolutely.
The speech by the Vice President Pence, given on October 4 in Washington, has been interpreted in America as a declaration of a Cold War. Mm-hmm. And the President said, just after it was given, he said, China's getting too big, we're about stopping that. So that was interpreted as Cold War. More sophisticated spokespeople for America, like James Mattis, the Defence Secretary, said, when asked, we see China as a strategic rival, but that doesn't imply hostility. So Cold War, strategic rival, but not necessarily hostility. The worry about this relationship degenerating into Cold War, though, is that Cold Wars produce misunderstanding, miscalculation, and an accident, a clash at sea or in the air, and people like countries like Australia would want to know that there are off-ramps in this relationship before it becomes the penultimate moment, a choice between war and peace. Question over here, George.
Thank you very much for this lovely talk. My question is, how important is the relationship between private industry and research from universities, considering that Australia ranks the lowest amongst the OECD?
Yeah. When you look at innovative cultures, and not just the US and increasingly China, if you look at Israel, if you look at Germany, it's extremely important. And Australia's low intensity is again, it's unfortunate. So it'd be nice if we haven't really had the culture, and even our multinational businesses here, I mean, there's a lot to consider here. I mean, our multinational businesses from the US and others, Europe, we are fundamentally, we're not investing in pure R&D and applied R&D. They're not investing that money here because essentially we're branch office sales and marketing countries. It has a massive impact on the ability to solve real 21st century problems and to scale our innovation base. It is one very, very important structural factor of a low innovation and commercialization intensity.
Yeah, question here. Oh, over here first.
Okay, yeah. Okay. First, I'm a Chinese, but I live in Australia for more than 30 years. Before coming to Australia, I was working in Chinese academic of science doing research, so I understand lots of China, what they creative and what they are doing. I also live in Australia for 30 years, so I understand Australia. Maybe I have misunderstanding US, but not misunderstanding Chinese and Australia. When the both panelists are talking about the future of Australia, so when China is growing and America is slowed down, and when Australia should be part of. But also, if we compare with history, if we're looking at after First World War and before the Second War, when you look at the German, when Hitler came to power, the German also grew very quickly and very fast. And after technology, after Second World War, U.S. and Soviet Union learned from make the jet fly, make missile, V2, it grew very, very quick. The question is, China still in a dictatorship country, so when they grown up, they have when do the business visit China, they have lots of questions. For example, if you have to agree with him some politically, maybe you can do the business. Otherwise, you can have a difficulty to do business. And when the Chinese continue growing, maybe one day we have to say, if you doesn't follow us, then you out of business. So how we Australia the position, how we protect our freedom in the future. If we look at German, Nazi German, the Hitler lock up lots of the Jewish people and put the concentration camp. But now China put a lot of people, like Vegas, 10% of population into the concentration camp as well. So I think we, Australia, we should also consider doing business in the same time protect our own freedom. So that's my question.
Thank you. To you.
It's the difference, I would say, from then and now is, even though what's happened in Argentina, they've all said, well, the WTO is not the strongest in the world. I still think it has changed the way people do things. And I think as a society, we've matured a lot more. Talks about war and so forth. I think it's now all about economic war and economic proxy wars. What Australia needs to do is, it's very clear for Australia. Australia knows it's not new heading into China. It's been doing business for a long time. It knows what is expected of people doing business in the country. And there's a lot of experts in Australia who can guide, and there's Australia-China business councils and federations. So Australia just needs to be clear, and I think Australian firms are. The purpose of their business in China, why are they going to China? And a lot of our young talent goes to China, entrepreneurial mindsets who finish their degrees in Australia and try their hand in China. And they've done successfully. They don't have to follow everything, but at the same time, they know what the basic rules and principles they have to follow. So as long as you as a manager or as a firm know what your role is, and as long as it's limited to the economic side of things, then the political side of things is something you'd hope governments will deal with in a more effective manner.
And our last question please introduce yourself and tell us what you do at Rouse Hill High School.
Thank you. I'm Kate Wang, and I'm the Chinese teacher for these students. It's a real pleasure for us to be able to come tonight. Thank you for having us.
You're welcome.
Bob, you posed the question, what positive can my students take out for the future? I think there's two things. We could get very frightened as Australia as the small guy stuck between two bullies in the canteen line. That's how I always see it. Or we could actually see that our advantage is, as an island, we have had to look outside more than the US has. We are quite aware of international relations, and maybe we could challenge ourselves to be more culturally sensitive and aware than the US's reaction. I agree with the Chinese person before who said, why is the US scared? China would never do that. The US, Chinese have worshipped the US for decades. And a Chinese person wouldn't, if you say to them, do you hate the US? They'd look at you and go, what? It's not a position that they would go to automatically. And that's got a lot of things to do with their philosophies, their respect for wealth, and also their different philosophies for Confucianism and Buddhism and all sorts of things like that. They just don't treat people like that. Perhaps we can have a position where we help the US understand, and that's an advantage because we have cultural knowledge. That's just a little bit more, because we're a little bit more distant from that conflict. We can help speak reason into the situation. I think that's a future that our young people can help with. Also, I've been teaching my students now for a while about the concept of maybe. I think a lot of Asia runs off this concept. It's the positivity that is the innovative force in China. If we could learn from that, Australia, the idea of, well, you know, we maybe didn't create it, or maybe we did, or maybe we can just put a different bent on it. You know, maybe, I think Australia just could expand our thinking a little bit more to allow for this kind of flexible moving with the times and that sort of thing. This generation, they do that all the time with their phones and their technology, and I think they're going to be ready to learn that from China and cooperate with China. I think that's really positive to take into the future. It's not something we have to go to school, we learn a finite set of facts, that's it, we leave, and that's all we use for the rest of our life. But this idea of we continue to learn, we learn from others, and maybe we're a bit cheeky. Now, Australia can be cheeky, but I think we've lost some of that ability to be cheeky, and that maybe holds some hope.
I especially love that latter point, because one of the things I write about a lot and research a lot is we're always told that we're living in an accelerating age of complexity. You know, technology is accelerating, globalization makes things complex. In many ways, I think China's long history, its culture, its complicated culture, it in many ways could be much better geared for this age of complexity in many, many ways than the US is. And I think, I agree with you, I think that's a lovely way of a sort of a rallying cry to Australia and the youth, all of us really, but the youth especially, to engage in this open and curious, culturally curious way that has been different to previous generations. I think it's a lovely thought, and I hope we do it.
That's a nice spot on which to end our discussion tonight, with me thanking Sandy and Hussain, Carl for making the introduction to these splendid panellists, and to thank all of you. This has been our 25th event of the year. We're proud of that. We like holding events and posting them on our website, making them accessible. But a great honour to get students from Rouse Hill High School and their excellent teacher here tonight. What an advertisement for the school system in this state. John Ward, a former director of the Board of Studies, sitting behind you, one of our regular attendees. For all of you who've been to our events in the past, thanks for supporting this think tank of ours, the only one in the country devoted to studying the Australia-China relationship. I've learned an immense amount from our two panellists, so please join me. I'm sure you've had the same experience this evening in thanking Hussain and Sandy for their great contributions.
Thank
you
you.
very
Thank
much.
you.